certainly good to be back at the ARPA-E Summit after a few years and to join Secretary Granholm, DepSec Turk, and of course all of you. I also want to shout out to Evelyn Wang, the ARPA-E director, who of course has for many years been my MIT colleague, working in the MIT Energy Initiative, and I think she's extremely creative, and I think the agency is in great hands. I looked forward to being part of this 13th summit, and I do remind everyone that I was also the 13th Energy Secretary. While Lucky 13 seems to be the convenient unit, I do want to emphasize that the counting is quite different. Certainly from 1977 to through my tenure, the average tenure of the Energy Secretary was 3.08 years on average, not annual. But there are obviously more important numbers to be counting, like over 1,100 projects from ARPA-E, attracting well over $6 billion of follow-on investment. So again, congrats to ARPA-E, congrats to all of you. I think ARPA-E has been a terrific initiative, almost 2 decades in the making, and it really has changed, I think, the face of public-private innovation in the energy space. In these few minutes, I'll highlight some of our thinking on clean energy innovation at the Energy Futures Initiative. That's a nonprofit that I formed in 2017 with 2 DOE colleagues, Joe Heiser and Melanie Kenderdine, following our service during the Obama years. In the 6 years since that time, we've seen major changes to the DOE opportunity space, particularly with the recent, rather stunning legislative actions all taken within 9 months. The bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and of course the Inflation Reduction Act. These laws considerably enlarged DOE's remit in the end-to-end innovation space. They represent a major step on industrial policy. We could say industrial strategy to be a bit more genteel, but certainly industrial policy beyond the traditional focus on the military industry sector that has historically attracted bipartisan support. Clearly, competition with China lurks behind the motivation for much of this legislative activity, including the somewhat, at least, bipartisan nature of the activity. However, the climate challenge has seen us falling farther and farther behind the pace of clean energy transition needed to meet scientifically supported greenhouse gas emissions goals. The IPCC just reminded us of this again in pretty stark terms. A consequence is the pragmatic need for industrial strategy if we ought to have any chance of deploying clean energy at the needed pace and scale. There's no doubt that we need to continue the type of technology innovation that ARPA-E is known for, but we also need to focus on helping take the outcomes of ARPA-E, R&D, and other initiatives to deployment at scale. The history of industrial policy, we know, is checkered, but again, in my view, we need it to have any chance to perform at the scale that we need and in the time scale that we need. So there are 2 major questions that I will touch on. First, we see the implementation that we need. Will we see the implementation that we need to succeed in this industrial strategy? In particular, to have laws like IRA yield its full intended benefits. Second, is the legislation that we have in hand, as important and impressive as it is, not only necessary, but also sufficient to meet ultimate goals? Frankly, I think not. And there's still more to the conversation. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has foot-stomped the point that the clean energy climate discussion cannot be pursued effectively in a silo. It must be part of one conversation that balances objectives for decarbonization and energy security and more: geopolitics, economics and affordability, social equity, etc. We all understand the equities established by climate science of speeding up dramatically our progress towards a net zero emissions economy, indeed even a net negative emissions economy in the long term. But I'm not sure it helps in the real world of complex and real human needs and politics, with parts of the world, of course, at very, very different levels of development, to lead the argument with 1.5 degrees centigrade rather than meeting a multiplicity of human needs that includes holding global warming to as little as possible. It's often said, and frankly we just heard, that we need to save the planet. The planet's going to be fine. We need to save humanity. I believe that extreme weather will be the preeminent driver of societies eventually addressing greenhouse gas emissions more seriously than has been the case, despite the massive change and dislocation that will result. We do love our children and grandchildren, as was referred to, but apparently just not enough to dramatically change our energy trajectory more rapidly than has happened in the past. On the other hand, it's becoming understood, mainly through extreme weather, that climate change is costing and changing lifestyles of current generations, and that now is getting attention. The question is timescale, to the political tipping point. I do believe we'll get there as public opinion more and more demands action. And when the politics tips, I believe it will happen rapidly, as the foundations are laid in both technology and policy. Again, it's clear that technology innovation that lowers the cost of providing the full spectrum of energy services is core to solutions. And that's where ARPA-E and DOE more broadly, and its national labs and the private sector are all central to a successful outcome. It's often forgotten that when the Clean Air Act amendments came together fairly quickly in 1990 to address acid rain, the DOE and the private sector had spent years demonstrating the technology needed, scrubbers, so that when the politics was right, it was clear that a solution could be implemented. And of course, it then proved to be even less expensive than predicted once the need was firmly established. This is where ARPA-E and other, again, innovation initiatives come in to make possible the policy and political transition that we will eventually put in place with clean energy technology deployed at scale. So I'll just make a few remarks in the minutes left in 4 areas related to this agenda. Each of these areas could and should provide the basis for much more extensive discussion, but that's what 20 minutes will do. First, the implementation challenge. President Biden said it quite simply: the big job in front of us is implementing the laws we passed. There's chatter about reversing IRA. That's not going to happen, although the road for implementation may be rougher than it needs to be if the new House of Representatives majority, in fact, carries through, as it probably will, on its announced intention to exercise aggressive oversight of implementation. The new initiatives fundamentally broaden DOE's energy mission across the innovation supply chain. Now, DOE's responded. DOE's reorganization around the S3 position, the undersecretary position for essentially for deployment and demonstration, called infrastructure, is a very, very good step. It's unfortunate that the nominee has not yet been confirmed, and we hope this will not become even more challenging as the 2024 election already is beginning to loom. I might say that when I was secretary, I also had problems getting a third undersecretary confirmed, And we did workarounds, but it's not the same. And this is a much more complex situation of dealing with an expanded mission. So the Senate really needs to work with the department, the administration, Secretary Granholm, to fill out the team in order to execute what Congress has already passed. It's a very important time as the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations and the Loan Program Office takes on new mission responsibilities, broader responsibilities. So we need to move on with that. A second question, and again, I'm not being comprehensive, but a second very important question, I believe, in the implementation agenda is resolving what the role of the 17 national labs is. Historically, the labs, like the department, have focused in research and development. So a real question, and I don't have the answer, is how will their missions, how should their missions evolve if they are to stay in sync with the DOE's broader clean energy mission in demonstration and deployment? The labs have always been involved in crosscuts, which is part and parcel of what is being talked about. For example, the model of the Lab Grid Modernization Consortium. But how will this evolve in the public-private partnership world that DOE is now very much in the middle of? Will the labs be empowered in this dimension? Will they be empowered, indeed maybe required, to be regional innovation engines, including in this more advanced innovation phase? So again, we should understand that DOE has stepped out nicely on the implementation challenge, but the reality is there is still much more to do. Steps such as putting out the hydrogen hub request for concept papers, basically, and receiving 79 from all across the country was a major step in terms of the hydrogen discussion being accelerated without even spending any money yet. But the reality is things like developing the demand side of the hydrogen market development is one that really needs to be really started and addressed. And there, again, cost-reducing technology will be very, very crucial. Secondly, let me make a few words on the legislative framework and some of the steps that are needed beyond it. As I said, I do believe that it's a great foundation, but we need more. A very straightforward part, for example, would be the Treasury rules for the IRA, which have been much talked about, but need to be moved forward. The less straightforward, we also hear a lot about permitting reform, streamlining permitting, absolutely crucial. Wires, pipes, CCS, hydrogen, all of these are going to require, I believe, much more creative approaches to environmentally sound permitting. I would just note, arithmetic tends to be sometimes depressing. For example, if you take the Princeton result on the need for expanding high voltage transmission and take only, say, 30% of the requirements to 2030 to be new wires as opposed to expansion of capacity, you're talking even there about the order of 200,000 transmission towers to 2030. This is the kind of challenge we face across the infrastructure map, absolutely essential. This is not for the faint of heart. I mentioned CCS. CCS is inherently very complex. You have an industrial facility or a power plant. You have a transportation network for CO2. You have underground storage. You have issues of verification of continued sound storage. You start thinking about this, like in California, we found one would need 20 permits from different agencies. We need some streamlining of these processes to go forward. And similarly with hydrogen, will we need new legislation, for example, to create new prerogatives for a place like FERC, for example? A third major question where I think the current framework, again, great start, but more to be done, relates to the question of bankability of clean energy projects. Today, there's a lot more capital available, frankly, than there are blue chip clean energy investments out there. We need to change this. We need to marry the investor perspective with the policy perspective, the regulatory perspective, in order to get projects, again, to be clean energy projects to be so blue chip that investment committees, at banks want to say yes and not no. I mentioned CCS. There's a clear example. Without addressing all of the issues around that, it'd be very hard to get private capital unleashed. So again, a lot to do in terms of building on and beyond the infrastructure law and the IRA. Similarly, by the way, in the nuclear arena, small modular reactors and the like, the laws, the department have done great stuff in terms of moving forward, supporting advanced reactors and the like. But the reality is we need a lot more. The just now published pathways to commercial liftoff from the department address some of these issues. For example, for nuclear, you're going to need an order book. You're going to need risk sharing among different operators. A nuclear industrial entity, it's not like Boeing that can take the first of a kind costs and average them over the first 200 planes. So we're going to have again, public-private partnership that really lowers or eliminates these kinds of barriers, let's say on risk sharing. A third area I'll just comment on very briefly, energy security and clean energy, which I mentioned are one discussion. I'll just mention, my time is expiring, just one issue, the issue of natural gas. This remains, frankly, an unresolved issue in terms of the climate discussion for the transition from now to the very low carbon future. We need pragmatism. I'll quote John Brown, Lord Brown, who stated last year, pragmatism delivered at speed is better than perfection that comes too late. That's kind of the mantra that we need throughout our pragmatic view of advancing these clean energy solutions. And by the way, I think COP28 is a prime opportunity for all of us to pitch in, make that a success in moving a much more pragmatic view towards the future. And finally, I'll just end by saying that the broader discussion also involves the kind of technology spaces in which ARPA-E operates and many of you operate. For example, I would argue that three parts of the climate discussion have evolved very positively just in the last couple of years. One, there is now, I think, a clear recognition that firm power is needed at a considerable amount of it is needed to complement variable power. Nuclear, fission, and I might add fusion would be one example of providing that firm power. Secondly, and again, this is a change in the last few years. There is no question, I would argue, anymore that we need a lot of affordable low-carbon fuels, or hydrogen could be part of that, providing fuel services, for example. Advanced biofuels, we've never quite gotten over the hump, et cetera. We need to get back to that very, very serious innovation agenda on fuels, and that is broadly recognized. And third, although probably less a consensus or a bit farther from consensus, would be the need for carbon dioxide removal for large-scale carbon management is now very firmly entrenched, in particular with those who exercise the most sophisticated models, recognizing we cannot make our goals without large-scale carbon dioxide removal. And that will be another important area, I think, for ARPA-E and other innovation programs to be pursuing. And I might say that the need for innovation is not only in technology, it's also in policy. For example, at EFI, we had a report recently, end of last year, on, do we need a public utility model, for example, for managing large-scale, at large-scale CO2? Lots and lots of options, but we need to start thinking about those now if that's going to be a scalable enterprise in the next decade. So, bottom line, again, enormous steps forward in the last year and a half. DOE is responding, but there's an awful lot left to do to have this agenda really converge into real climate, energy security, and social equity progress. Thank you.